Everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of our Hart program. I am Stacy Bowe, Training Coordinator for the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and I'm here with Ella Weiner, who is our Training Project Assistant, who is providing technical backup today. So thanks everyone for joining us. We are excited to have our speaker here today. But just in case, if we have any new attendees on the line today, I was just going to do a little bit of an introduction to get everybody on the same page. So HART stands for Heritage Emergency and Response Training, which is a week-long program sponsored by the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and hosted by the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Financial support for these webinars is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we are thrilled to have their support, as well as the Andrew W. Millen Foundation for the HART program overall. So the goal of HART is to provide realistic hands-on training on damage assessment, rapid documentation, emergency evacuation and salvage, rehousing and storage, crisis communication, and team building. So we do cover a lot in this training program. And this 5-part webinar series aims to build upon the in-person HART program, reinforcing concepts that were covered by that in-person training. As you see here, we've got pictures on the screen from our first HART program that was held last November in Washington, D.C., and we welcome the graduate class to this webinar. Hi, guys. And last month, we actually completed Hart, Puerto Rico, where we brought a very similar hands-on training to museum professionals around the territory. And we hope to continue to help with the ongoing recovery work on that island. So again, welcome Hart, Puerto Rico graduates. But again, to what I was saying earlier, whether you participated in this training or not, we think you will find these webinars interesting and informative. When the series is over, the webinar recording will be uploaded to HENTEF's website, which is culturalrescue.si.edu/HENTF. And the website URL will be included on the last slide in case you didn't get that down. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ella to talk about the technical side of things.
Hi, everyone. So if at any point during the course of our webinar you start having some sort of technical issue, you can reach out to me through the questions box on your control panel, or you can send me an email. My email's at the bottom of the screen there. It's Weiner, W-E-I-N-E-R-E, @si.edu, and I'll do my very best to help you figure out what's going on so you can fully get as much contact as possible. Also, throughout the course of the webinar, I'm going to be monitoring the questions box for your questions for our lovely presenter. So as we're going through, if you have any clarifying questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Or if you have any questions that, for overall addressing the content that we're going over, please don't hesitate to ask. If you have that question, probably someone else listening does as well. And this is a great opportunity to get those kinds of questions answered. Also, as we go along, our presenter is going to be posing a few questions to you. So a few of those are going to be more yes or no style questions. So you have the ability in your control panel, you'll see a little icon of a hand. So to indicate the answer to a question is yes on your end, you just click the hand to signify you're raising your hand to say yes. At another point, Rick is going to ask a more open-ended question, and to respond to that, you can just do that in the questions section, and I'll take a good count of what people are saying and try and share some of that content with the rest of the audience. And if you have any questions about this or anything technical, please feel free to reach out to me. And yes, again, we'll be sharing the recordings of this webinar and the rest of the series, as this is number 4 in our 5-part series, with you after the conclusion of our 5th one, which will be on May 15th. Okay, thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Ella. All right. And actually, yes, one more extra piece of information our speaker has very nicely shared with us a PDF version of his presentation, which can be found in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar tools section. So feel free to download a copy of that and follow along as well. It's great that he was able to provide us that in time for his presentation. So moving on, our instructor today is Dr. Richard Klomp, and he is a certified clinical traumatologist who has worked at the CDC since 2001. He has been very diligent looking at his bio. He has added value in the Office of Communications, the Injury Center, and the Office of Safety, Security, and Asset Management by focusing on individual and community resilience, work-life wellness, and counseling. And his emergency response involvement includes supporting CD staff deployed to the tsunami in 2004, the outbreak of the Marburg hemorrhagic fever in 2005, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, Haiti, or the earthquake in Haiti, Ebola in West Africa, and the CDC's Zika response. And furthermore, he has led the work group that created the clinic's pre-deployment well-being screening and post-deployment outreach processes. For 9 years, he led the initiative he developed with psychiatrists from the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences to safeguard the health, safety, and resilience of individuals CDC deploys to dangerous environments in response to public health emergencies. So we definitely are looking forward to what Rick has to say over his very extensive work in this field. So thanks again, Rick, and take it away.
Okay, I'm very much looking forward to visiting with y'all today, and we're going for the slides right now. 1 second. And you should be seeing the slides right about now. Okay, I'm assuming that everybody can see my slides. Is that correct?
Yeah, they look great.
Okay, thank you. I am grateful for this opportunity to visit with y'all today, and I appreciate Stacy's introduction and highlighting some of the chances that I've had during my 16 years at CDC to help safeguard the health, safety, and resilience of people that we deploy to some dangerous, inhospitable, and potentially traumatizing environments. I believe that during the course of the presentation today, when we will have a little bit of interaction, hopefully you will see that we share many common concerns and that we're exposed to similar kinds of threats. I'm sorry that the majority of my references and examples will be public health examples, but I'm sure everybody on the line will be able to abstract out similarities in the kinds of work that you're doing as part of the Heritage Emergency and Response Training Series that it's focused on addressing. I hope that you also will realize that this mental health portion of the training that you're receiving today is every bit as relevant as some of the hands-on, very pragmatic, specific training that you've received in the past in this series. I have some fairly unusual initials behind my name. They're very unusual for here at CDC. After getting an undergraduate degree in communications with a minor in psychology, I obtained my first master's degree in organizational behavior. I joke around that that means I've got mob connections, as you can see there, especially when I tell people that I grew up in Reno and I've got family that lives in Vegas and we know people who know people, but I won't do that little joke with you anymore because it might be disconcerting to some people. I worked primarily in healthcare and telecommunications industry for about 16 years. and realized that I needed additional information, additional expertise to be able to move from introducing and managing change on a large systemic level to being able to introduce and manage change in individual lives. So I went back to school and obtained a second graduate degree focusing on community counseling, which actually is focused on individual change. The LPC stands for Licensed Professional Counselor. The BCPC means I'm board certified, and most recently I obtained a certification in clinical traumatology. That gives me some different ways to look at different aspects of problems that you and your colleagues and my colleagues and I experience on a potentially regular basis. What we're hoping to accomplish today is relatively simple, I believe. We want to literally be reading off of the same page relative to definitions of stress, burnout, and resilience. And as is the case in many fields, there are few universally recognized and accepted gold standard definitions of stress or of burnout or of resilience. So I will try and share representative definitions for you so that we can be approaching this from the same basic perspective. You all are experts on the stressors that you have encountered during some of your collections work and your preservation work. You also are aware of day-to-day stressors, which can carry over into emergency response situations. So I'm going to present what I believe are some potentially relevant examples, and hopefully we'll be able to add to that so that it feels very specific and relevant to what you're doing. In addition to stressors, we'll be taking a look at factors that contribute to resilience. So in our public health language, we're talking about risk factors and protective factors. It's really our focus there. And then we'll conclude with some ways that we can protect ourselves to avoid burnout. And I hope that's making sense to everybody so far, and that my voice is coming through loud and clear. The federal agency SAMHSA pulled together information from a variety of sources, and they highlighted a few concepts that I think are a helpful foundation to kind of guide the rest of our conversation. That first bullet there, when it says that no one who experiences a disaster is untouched by it, is sometimes misinterpreted. Sometimes people say, well, no, wait a minute. I was in a horrible natural disaster. I saw this hurricane hit. I experienced this or I experienced that, and I didn't wind up having to seek psychiatric treatment. To which I say, no, that's exactly right. This doesn't say that no one who experiences a disaster is not destroyed. It says untouched. If, for example, when somebody flew a couple of planes into skyscrapers in New York City, I was scheduled to be headed out west to a niece's wedding. You may recall that the airports were closed, airlines were grounded for about 4 days, as I recall. It was very weird when the airline service came back online, because the country still was a little bit concerned and uncertain. The normal routine had been disrupted and people's confidence had been damaged. So those are the kinds of things that first bullet is referencing, that we're touched by it, not necessarily destroyed. In fact, the majority of people who experience traumatic events are not manifesting clinical symptoms of pathology. Anyway, I'll move along and we'll get into some of those issues a little bit more downstream. You see also that the majority of people tend to be fairly collaborative. They tend to pull together. They tend to try and help out. And if you think about some plane crashes, you think about some other situations that have happened, there are lots of good Samaritans that try and pitch in a little bit. There's a reference here to individual and collective trauma, and I'll talk a little bit more about the collective trauma when I get into around slide 14, 15. But I think that makes sense to you as well, that communities can be damaged. The trajectory of individuals' lives can be changed permanently. And those are common byproducts of major disasters and traumatic exposures. Where you read also on the fourth bullet, it's talking about behavioral health concerns. We talk here about different phases of response, different phases of a disaster with the preparedness, response, and recovery. And there are challenges in each of those areas, also opportunities. I think the next to the last bullet is especially important, and it's a big part of what a lot of mental health professionals like me do on a daily basis. We emphasize that when someone is temporarily overcome with emotion, and they might cry for 20 or 30 minutes after a traumatic event. Once again, that does not mean that they are having a pathological abnormal reaction. That would in fact be considered under most circumstances a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So we do wind up spending a fair amount of time normalizing behavior so people don't say, oh, I'm so weak. This has disrupted my sleep for a couple of nights, as you'll see a couple of slides from now. And I think this is 100% relevant to the work that you do. Disaster mental health assistance often is a lot more practical than psychological in nature. There is no attempt to turn you all into many psychologists or psychiatrists. We're not attempting to make you feel obligated to apply any highfalutin techniques to yourself or to colleagues with whom you might be working who are demonstrating some distress. A lot of times, all somebody needs in a disaster situation is permission to disengage for half an hour or an hour and kind of collect their thoughts. Maybe they need a cup of coffee. Maybe they need a blanket. Maybe they need a place to sit down that's not dirty or muddy or wet or bloody. So a lot of times the assistance that we provide can be very, very practical and not the teeniest bit clinical. A couple of definitions of disasters here. I think this will be relevant as well. You see here that we're talking about typically a sudden onset. We're talking about damage, usually extensive damage, certainly can have an ecological component, may or may not involve loss of human life, but certainly leads to deterioration of health and health services. So that's pretty universal. The second part really bumps something out of the realm of being a significant event to being a disaster when it actually exceeds the capacity of the affected community on a significant scale. It drains all of their resources and they wind up coming short. A brief example in the Atlanta area is that a few years ago we had a bus accident right in downtown Atlanta, and we had a local baseball team, not professional, but a collegiate baseball team, and several of the players were badly injured. In a small rural area, that might have constituted a disaster if there was only one hospital and it didn't have enough capacity in the emergency department to handle that. But this happened a couple of blocks away from Grady Memorial, which is a huge hospital. We probably have 45 to 55 hospitals that can handle this. So it was a tragic situation. It was unfortunate. It involved some loss of life, but it wouldn't rise to the level of disaster according to this definition. And I'm not trying to minimize severity, just trying to distinguish between something that completely overwhelms and consumes all existing resources and requires collaboration, support, and resources from external sources. This definition of individual trauma also comes from SAMHSA, and I am assuming that you've got it in front of you. I'll try not to read every word on every screen. I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. I'll go ahead and take a couple of seconds and review that, please. So we see it talking about events or series of events experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. Some of you may have asked yourself the question, well, does that mean that two people could be in the exact same situation and one person could be traumatized by it and another not so much or not at all? And the short answer is yes, that's exactly correct. And we have evidence of that all around us. We have soldiers who are in harm's way, who are taking fire from an enemy, maybe 10 or 15 people in that squad. And the reality is that we don't have 10 or 15 people who are showing up at sick bay the next day, or who are talking to the corpsman, the medic who's helping them, saying that none of them were able to sleep, or that none of them were able to function properly, and that they all need assistance of some sort. They all need medication. That doesn't happen. That's not minimizing what is experienced by an individual, what is perceived or interpreted by an individual, because the reality is that none of us is on the exact same footing emotionally or mentally as everybody else. We all start in a different place. So even though we might have the same stressor, even though we might experience the same impact, we're not all starting at the exact same place. So it can then, certain people can experience negative mental, physical, social, or spiritual degradation. I like these definitions of stress. The top ones are a little bit poetic, and I can picture a very articulate, very energetic person saying, "Oh, stress is like the strings on a violin. If it's too tight, the strings just might break. If it's too loose, you don't get a good sound from those violin strings." So that analogy kind of makes sense for me. And what it says is that we're not shooting for the absence of stress. We're not shooting for a maximum amount, but we're looking for an optimum amount. Once again, the second definition here references the fact that it really is a normal response to an abnormal situation. We get into some physics types definitions, and it talks about overload or underload of matter or energy, so too much or too little of something. To me, that is encapsulated best in the definition from Dr. Ken Matheny, who was a highly respected professor at Georgia State University. He talked about a perceived inadequacy of resources necessary to complete a specific task. So what he was saying is, stress is when we don't have what we think we need to do what we have to do. And I use lots of examples of that when I'm teaching in smaller groups. Those can be financial resources. Those can be time. So you're rushing to get someplace, and you have a mechanical problem. These are all resources. In the absence of those resources, our stress increases dramatically. And trying to depict with this photo that poor kitty might feel like she or he is a little bit short on resources in terms of teammates, cover, defense, places to run and hide in the presence of those potential stressors. What I would like to do on these next 3 slides is ask you to go ahead and raise your hands and tell me if you have seen at least half of these physiological signs of stress in a coworker or in a family member in a stressful situation. So we'll discuss them in just a little bit more detail, but I wanted to get you a little bit more engaged. So if you could look at this list with the fatigue, nausea, fine motor tremors, so kind of shaking, so tics, so that could be like a nervous tic of the eye or around the mouth. Paresthesia is defined there as numbness or tingling, as if you sat on your leg and your foot kind of went to sleep, and when you stand on it, it kind of tingles. That's what paresthesia is. Profuse sweating, dizziness, a little GI upset. So that is a polite way of saying your stomach is boiling, or maybe you have some diarrhea related to the stress. Heart palpitations, some people's heart kind of skips a beat or accelerates a little bit. Some people feel distress in their throat with some choking or so difficulty swallowing or difficulty breathing. So let me quit talking for a moment and give you a chance to say, have you seen half or more, or I should say at least half of those physiological signs of stress in colleagues or in family members in a stressful situation? Go ahead and raise your hand if you've seen about half of those.
So we're getting the responses coming in, and one of our participants' comments, certainly have seen in the context of previous emergency calls and traumatic events that I've been on. And then in terms of people who are raising their hands, I would say at least half of our participants are raising their hands right now.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. Now I'd like to change the question just a little bit. That question was, have you observed these signs of stress in others? And it sounds like a little bit over half of you have seen those in others. So I want to change the question and say, how many of you have experienced about half or more of these signs of stress yourself when you were involved in some kind of a traumatic event. So maybe an automobile accident, or some type of a natural disaster, or a near miss, or some kind of a earthquake or tsunami or hurricane kind of thing. So this is, have you experienced and shown these signs of stress yourself?
If you raised your hand for the previous question, you just need to re-raise it again for this time if it applies as well. And I would say, again, we're getting about half of the participants raising their hand saying that yes.
Great, very, very helpful. Thank you for that that little bit of polling there, and the fact that that about half of us have seen these and have experienced these kinds of things should go a long way to helping you understand that these are common symptoms. They are not indicators of somebody who is falling apart, or who is weak, or who is somehow not coping very well. We're going to look at a couple more slides, and then I will kind of summarize this just a little bit. So these are our cognitive signs of stress, and I don't believe that we need to take the time to have you raise your hands again, but in stressful situations, it is very common for somebody to have a difficult time remembering details. You got to remember that our body is amped up, our mind is amped up. It's like that definition. The strings on a violin of our body are getting very, very tight, and we're getting stretched quite thin sometimes. Typically, we're not sleeping well. There's fatigue, so it's not unusual. Anomia is a fancy way of saying that you forget the name of common things. Now, that's different than a parent calling a child the wrong name when they're upset. That's called normal parenting response. Anomia is you forget the name of something that you work with on a daily basis, a tool, a common object, that kind of thing. A lot of people have a difficult time making decisions because of the fourth item there. Sometimes they're not sure what's going on. And I'll give you an example that I think you can translate fairly easily into your world. I was visiting with a doctor several years ago, and she told me about a project that she worked on in Africa. And it doesn't matter, East, West Africa. She was working on a project, and they were weighing babies between the ages, I think, of about 6 months old and about 2 or 2.5 years old. And to make sure that they didn't weigh the same baby twice, they put a little wristband on each infant that they weighed. And then when the mother brought the baby back a couple of weeks later to be reweighed to see if the intervention that we were trying was helpful, they would remove that wristband, and everybody had the same color, and would apply a new wristband. So the whole focus here was, let's get accurate weights. Let's make sure we're measuring child A before and child A after. But this person told me that it was actually quite stressful work because these children were malnourished, and it was difficult for her and others who were very compassionate individuals to see the distress in these malnourished children. And she said that as an example of this confusing trivial with major issues, she somehow became very, very focused on keeping track of each one of these wristbands that had been clipped off the child's wrist when they were putting on the new one. And she said she got almost fanatical about it. She had to account for every single wristband. Well, the reality is that it didn't matter at all. It was not an important part of what was going on. But she used that as an example to say that cognitively she had slipped a little bit, and that she had become obsessed with something that was not particularly important, and was on the risk of overlooking some of her more important work. And I guess in your world, that might be focusing more on packing materials or on a shipping container as opposed to the actual contents. And I realize shipping containers and packing materials matter, but I would assume the contents are probably more important. Anyway, some people also are easily distracted, hard time concentrating. Certainly not able to concentrate. And an example that I use in our emergency response work is that we send out project managers into the field sometimes who are responsible for distributing equipment, supplies, materials, those kinds of things. And we interface with community officials And so every once in a while, we will know that a particular individual is responsible for 5,000 people. And so if they tell us they need like 50,000 sleeping bags, we could be suspicious and say, oh my gosh, they're trying to take advantage of these federal resources. Or we could say, you know what? I think this woman has been working for 17-hour days or 18-hour days for the last 5 days. Her home is underwater, so she's probably not trying to rip us off. She probably just carried an extra zero in her calculations. So that's an example of a calculation difficulty. And then in terms of behavioral and emotional signs of stress, it makes complete sense for somebody to be anxious or for somebody to be grieving the loss of their home or their family relationships or potentially of their employment or the knowledge of the whereabouts of their family members if, for example, their home has been washed away by a hurricane. I don't think any of us would feel confused or surprised if someone had spent 2 weeks trying to dig out the back room in a museum that had been flooded, if that person was a little bit irritable. Once again, their stress would be exacerbated by fatigue and frustration and their concern and their dedication. Easy to feel overwhelmed or anticipate harm. The gait change, some people might be unclear on what that means. It means that people actually start moving differently. They start walking differently. Typically, this would involve a young, vigorous 30-year-old who all of a sudden was kind of shuffling around as if they were 85. That's what gait change references. Hypervigilance. My wife, who grew up in Richmond, Virginia, was bitten by a cottonmouth snake when she was 13 years old and was on a family vacation in North Carolina. I do not consider my wife to be mentally unstable because she's a little bit hypervigilant to this day about circumstances, places that remind her of where she was bitten by that cottonmouth. She'd spent several days in a hospital, and her parents were told a couple of times that she wouldn't survive. So that stressor has remained with her. So hypervigilance is once again a fairly common response to a traumatic stressor. So I'm gonna go backwards just for a second here, back to the physiological signs. Now, I am not aware of anybody on the planet who can tell you exactly how many of these responses is completely normal and okay, and when moving, for example, from 5 of these signs to 6 would mean that you need to get help. But the point that I want to make, and I'll go back through these slides, is that having some physiological signs of stress, having some cognitive signs of stress, and once again, I can't quantify, is that 2 or 4, and having some behavioral or emotional signs of stress is a common response that one would expect from a healthy person who's just been through a hellacious kind of an event. Now, you may ask, okay, Rick, so if you're saying that physiological, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms of stress are common and to be expected, then when might we know if somebody was at greater risk? When might we know if someone potentially did need to get some support? Well, these items here are predictors. So the more of these items that are present in a traumatic stressor situation, the greater the likelihood that someone might be damaged by it. And I'll just kind of run through these. It makes complete sense, I believe. There's face validity to these points. But if I feel that my life is threatened, that's different. That's very different than just being inconvenienced. If I see mangled bodies, if I see completely damaged, destroyed artifacts, that could be incredibly distressing. And I'm going to talk in a couple of slides about how emotionally distressed we might be if, for example, we happen to be over in the Syrian city of Palmyra, and after it had been attacked with bulldozers and bullets and explosives, and we think about all those antiquities that had been damaged, destroyed, and looted. These are potential predictors. Surprise is a big deal. If we are caught flat-footed, so to speak, the intentionality of certain things. Human beings seem to be able to adjust much quicker to something that just happens. There's a landslide. I grew up in Oregon, Idaho, and Nevada. I spent the first 19 years of my life in mountainous areas, and sometimes a landslide happens. That's different than somebody putting ball bearings into a pressure cooker and igniting that at the end of a marathon. So that surprise, the intentionality. It's also distressing to be exposed to an invisible toxic agent. So think about pathogens, think about smallpox, think about anthrax, those kinds of things, or loss of a loved one. So if you want to think about an acronym, duration, intensity, and proximity of exposure is a pretty good way to remember that, that these are kind of predictors of potential psychiatric disorder, distress. In other words, I spend an extended period of time, the duration is significant, with a great intensity of exposure, and I'm really, really close to it. So there's also the potential way to deal with that by reducing the duration of exposure, by doing what we can to decrease the intensity. And in emergency response work in my world, we might try and reduce visual stimulation. So we might put a person's tent so that it didn't face towards the scene of the accident, or we might move them away so they're not hearing the fire burning or people crying. So you could apply that in your world to not making people work 12-hour shifts, which would be a duration, and not having them spend their whole shift in the most damaged part of a facility. And in terms of proximity, maybe we house them far enough off-site so they don't feel like their nose is being rubbed into the damaged situation. This next slide is very important. I'm going to let you review it more on your own when you download a PDF of the presentation, but these are the things that, that clinicians would look for. There are also things that you could look for, and this is really the answer to the question. We talked about physiological, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms of stress. When do I know that somebody has too much? And when do I know that I maybe ought to get them connected with a mental health professional? Well, here is the answer to that question. When they are so dazed that they are unclear about where they are, about what day it is. Now, that's not just somebody who's gotten real busy and they can't remember if it's Thursday or Friday. That's somebody that might be multiple days off. They're unclear about the time of day. They're unsure on where they are. So they're significantly disoriented. When we're talking about depression here, you see that it references a pervasive feeling of hopelessness and despair. So this isn't somebody who says, you know what, that really stinks that the roof got blown off of my house. Gosh, that's icky. This is somebody who feels extreme despair. This is someone who feels like their life is absolutely hopeless, like they're totally messed over, like there's no light at the end of any tunnel. There's just more tunnel, or maybe even a black hole. Anyway, we see the anxiety. So they are not just a little bit nervous, but they are constantly on edge. They can't relax. They are pacing, or they're hiding in a corner someplace. The fourth bullet, if you hear things that other people aren't hearing and you're not on a Bluetooth-enabled device, that's a potential danger sign that you're having a negative reaction to that traumatic experience. You see people who are disheveled, they smell of urine, they're not washing their face, they're not combing their hair, and this is assuming that we have resources to do that. Obviously, suicidal or homicidal thoughts, ideation's a big issue. Talks about problematic use of alcohol or drugs. So if somebody knocks down a couple of glasses of wine a week and they go from 2 glasses to 2.5 glasses, that isn't necessarily a reason why you would want to schedule them to see the psychiatrist. But if somebody is a complete teetotaler and doesn't drink anything, and you see them knocking down a 6-pack, that change is a big deal. Or somebody moves from a 6-pack to 4 6-packs in the same amount of time, we're looking for change. That would be one definition of problematic. And then any kind of intimate partner violence or abuse of children or elderly people. So this slide hopefully will be something that you never need to use, but also hopefully it will be of value to you in terms of minimizing your fears that you are missing some really dangerous signs or symptoms. Shift gears a little bit here and go to compassion fatigue. And this is something that we talk about in public health. And we say, do we think that people who are very much concerned about other people's health and welfare and well-being are at greater risk of compassion fatigue than the general population? And we determine, yes, we probably are at greater risk. We have much more access to information about wellness and well-being. We have dedicated our careers, most of us, to public health. So I would assume that you all would be at a significant risk of compassion fatigue relative to exposure to some of the things that we've already talked about in your profession, or relative to seeing your colleagues, your coworkers, getting worn down and becoming burned out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. You see the symptoms of compassion fatigue here in terms of decrease in experiencing pleasure, lots of stress, negative attitude. I want for us to have time to entertain questions at the end of the presentation, so I won't ask you to raise your hands right now online to see or to show that you know somebody who you believe demonstrates compassion fatigue, that they used to be really excited about work and now they have a negative attitude. But my experience is that in most of the classes that I teach, everybody knows somebody who is potentially a poster child for compassion fatigue. And when we look at a very simple equation, I think we can understand why. So we're talking about things building up and building up and building up. So I'm going to use a very simple example. Let's say that I'm driving home from work this evening. I'm on a freeway and I am 2 cars behind a school bus. And let's say that there is a big accident and the small car ahead of me, a 2-seater sports car, slams on its brakes, but it's going too fast and it slides up underneath the school bus, and I'm the next car in line. Primary stress would be, in a very coarse example, would be if my leg is broken in that accident. That would be my direct experience of trauma. A secondary stress could be witnessing the pain of the people in that little sports car that got smashed up underneath the bus, and maybe seeing children in distress on the school bus. Vicarious traumatization would be represented by me being taken to the hospital because of my broken leg, and having to wait in the lobby or in the hallway and hearing other people talk about the traumatic event. Oh, I heard the car's brakes squealing, and then I heard glass shattering, then I heard kids crying. That would be an example of the vicarious traumatization. You add those things together and can wind up in compassion fatigue. Burnout is a closely related concept. You see a definition here from the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, the state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. So I'm just pretty much fried on every possible level. Physically, I'm drained. Emotionally, I'm spent. And my mind is demonstrating a lot of those examples of stress that we were talking about before in terms of poor concentration, calculation deficits, those kinds of things. And this comes from being involved over time. So once again, it's difficult to get burned out on something in a half an hour. But if there's this continuous drain of resources. Now, this slide is something that if we were in a face-to-face setting, I would have you break up in subgroups, and each group generate a list of ways to turn these burnout risk factors, or risk factors for compassion fatigue, into protective factors. Since we are trying to hurry along and save time for questions at the end, I will just pick out 1 or 2 here. And for example, we joke around in public health that we didn't get into public health to become millionaires and to drive expensive luxury cars. So that lack of expected rewards is kind of a an emblematic thing for us. But there are things that we can do within the constraints of our respective organizations to provide some rewards in terms of recognition for contributions made. The expected rewards also could come in terms of addressing the first bullet up there about professional isolation. Sounds like the majority of you are engaged in and have already completed classes in the Heritage Emergency and Response Training Series. So that's a way to address professional isolation, and that may also feel like a reward to many of us to have the opportunity to learn and grow and be better prepared. And maybe you do some train the trainer, so you share this information. So that one example can address both professional isolation and lack of expected rewards. We also have the next to the bottom bullet there talks about continuous vulnerability. And you remember on the slide where we were talking about burnout, we referenced the fact that it's difficult to have this continuous drain. And when we had our acronym of DIP, duration, intensity, and proximity of exposure, so a way to turn this risk factor into a protective factor would be to interrupt their continuous vulnerability. Give them some downtime. If that can be hours, then let's make it hours. If that can be days, let's make it be days. If it can be weeks. So let's work within the constraints in our respective environments in a disaster situation. So those are examples of ways to turn burnout factors, burnout risks into protective factors. I always like to remind people, because every once in a while about this time in this kind of presentation, people will say, yeah, so that's great, you know, that touchy-feely stuff, but we got a job to do. We've got stuff that's got to happen, and I can't necessarily mitigate all of those physiological, cognitive, or behavioral symptoms, and we can't necessarily be all mamby-pamby. But I ask myself, and I ask you, how much work can you do? How effective and efficient can you be if you are fatigued to the point of exhaustion, if you are physically worn out? I mean, you're spent. You've been working 15, 16, 17-hour days for 5 or 6 days at a time. A phrase that we use a lot in my world is that emergency response is much more like a marathon than it is like a sprint. So think about world-class, world gold medal winners, sprinters who can just fly at short distances. There is not a sprinter on the planet who can sprint at full speed for an hour, much less an 8-hour shift or a 10 or a 12-hour shift, much less 3 or 4 days. We don't want somebody to absolutely be overwhelmed and incapacitated by over contributing, by giving more than they can give in a healthy manner. So we want them to shift their pace. And I'm not saying about slow down to the point of being a gold brick or not doing any work, but a marathoner runs at a different pace, especially amateur marathoners, or in my case, amateur 5K runners. We run at a very different pace. We've got questions here about attitudes going down the drain, or physical or emotional disruptions to our normal performance, or our family life, our home life. Begins to deteriorate, those kinds of things. So it really makes sense to invest before we need it in things that will help us be strong, both in mind, body, and spirit relative to emergency response. Now we're getting to the favorite part of my favorite part of the presentation, and that is focusing on the positive, productive side. There are a lot of definitions of resilience. I will focus on this one for you because I feel it's the most helpful, because it takes a three-prong approach. It doesn't just focus on withstanding stressors or changing demands. It doesn't just focus on recovering, but it also introduces the concept of post-traumatic growth, which as a clinician is incredibly important to me. So yes, we have to deal with the ravaging storm. Yes, we need to clean up and mop up afterwards. But eventually, when our life has, the trajectory of our life has been disrupted, typically in a negative direction, we have the potential to rise above. We have the potential to come out the other side as stronger, more compassionate, more other-centered, more productive individuals. So I really like this: withstand, recover, and grow in the face of stressors and changing demands. So to me, this definition applies not just in a disaster situation, but also in a pretty typical work situation. In my organization, we have restructurings on a fairly regular basis. We call them reorgs, and it seems like we're reorging every year and a half or 2 years. And I don't know if that's the case for you, but that's a potentially stressful situation. This next slide, I'm not going to go through in any great detail. But Doctors Betty and Rose Pfefferbaum, who are colleagues and friends of mine from Arizona and from the academic world, have identified attributes of resilient communities. So those of you who are in leadership situations, I would ask you to do a self-assessment and be honest. Do you feel that your team members feel that your team is a cohesive unit, that there is connection there, that everybody shares a similar commitment, that we share the same values? Does everybody have access to the resources necessary to do the job? Because you remember that goes back to one of the first definitions of stress, about not feeling like we have what we need to do what we need to do. So this is a potential measuring stick that you can use, potentially a rubric. This road to resilience comes from the American Psychological Association. These are 10 very specific things you can do. The URL is located there. You can actually download this. It's about a 14-page brochure. It talks about the importance of making connections. In every study that I've ever seen or ever heard of, social support is a significant protective factor. The flip side of that is if people start to withdraw, so you have a normally gregarious, happy, engaged, involved, outgoing, friendly person, and they start to withdraw, maybe they're 3 or 4 days into emergency response, maybe they've been so badly damaged emotionally or psychologically by the loss of these antiquities that they're working with, maybe it just kind of takes their knees out from under them, metaphorically speaking. We want to watch out for that withdrawal. Some resilient people are able to not view a crisis as something that's absolutely insurmountable. In other words, it's not the end of the world. They acknowledge the fact that change is a part of living. In fact, if you think about it, every living thing is changing, and even lots of inanimate things are changing. I think about the Grand Canyon, which didn't used to be a Grand Canyon. It used to be a fairly flat riverbed, I believe. Moving towards goals, so teleology, being able to take decisive action. So these 10 items are very, very helpful and are an excellent starting place. And once again, nobody on the phone needs to have clinical skills. If you see someone who is suffering, if you see someone who is confused, if you see someone who appears to be stumbling around, either literally or symbolically in their emergency response work, this list of 10 things would be very, very helpful to share with them. And it's not a lecture. You're not berating them. You're not criticizing them. But you can say, you know what, let's see if we can keep things in perspective. So have we been through tough situations before? Well, yeah, we had that fire and we were able to recover from that. We had that flood over there. This hopeful outlook. Optimism is directly correlated with resilience, that ability to withstand, recover, and grow in the face of stressors and changing demands. And this taking care of yourself, once again, gets back to my little saying that that emergency response is a lot more like a marathon than a sprint. In terms of self-care, I go to great lengths to encourage my coworkers before they go out the door to emergency response to look at each of these 5 areas of self-care that are emphasized here on slide number 20. Take a look at the physical side. Are there things that they need to throw into their go bag, into their backpack that they're going to take with them on emergency response? Do they need to throw in some Cliff Bars? I'm not endorsing a specific product, but is there some nutrition that they need? Do they need a certain kind of cashews or M&Ms or trail mix or whatever? Do they need a sleep mask, something to cover their eyes if they need complete dark to sleep in? I have earplugs and a sleep mask. I know a former Navy SEAL who has an oversized stocking cap that he can pull down over his eyes, and it gives him just a little bit of sound buffering as well. So those are just some examples of physical things that we can do. Emotionally, it's hard to pull somebody out of a river if you're drowning yourself. In fact, it's pretty much almost impossible. So we need to be on solid ground emotionally. We should have healthy relationships. It would be very difficult to be in an abusive situation, to never know one day to the next what you were going to have in your home life, and then go out into a very really stressful situation. That would be one of the examples of not starting off in the same place. Cognitively, I encourage people to have some very engaging reading material on their ebook or their iPad or whatever. In fact, I understand they still make books on paper, so you could go old school and take some engaging reading. I have literally a half a dozen books on my night table. You may even want to pack a boring book, because that can be more effective than sleep medicine sometimes. Behaviorally, you see civic involvement. That can help us feel better about ourselves. It can also be a nice break and change of pace. Also, family preparedness. And we're not trying to turn everybody into preppers, but you might sleep a little better if you knew that you had a backpack that had 72 hours worth of food and water in it that you could grab and go if you needed to. And then some people get very nervous when they see the S word for spiritual. We're not proselyting. We're not telling anybody what to do. If you are currently a meditator, if that's how you maintain your balance, we would respectfully suggest that you do your best to try and meditate when you're doing emergency response work. If you currently pray, keep on praying. The fellowship and volunteering we mentioned just a little bit. I like to do Tai Chi after I run a 5K. It helps me get my breath back. So if you're into Tai Chi, keep tying that Chi. Keep doing the kinds of things that you've been doing to the best of your ability, realizing that we don't have complete freedom there. Now, in terms of managing stress at work, I would like for you to look at these questions as I do this build slide. This is talking about day in and day out. Are you taking breaks? Are you able to go for a little walk? Do you have some interactions with colleagues? Do you get away from work for lunch? And please don't ask me if I do that, because I don't do that as often as I probably should. Some people leave part of their vacation time on the table each year and maybe view that as a badge of loyalty. I would suggest that's a potentially risky strategy, because a battery that has not been completely recharged is not going to last as long, and it is going to be difficult to recharge if it's continually maintained in an improper manner. So here's ways to manage stress at work. We could spend a full hour very easily talking about the effects of sleep deprivation, but I'm going to let you take a look at this list. It's a long list. It's a little bit busy for a slide, but the irritability and lapse in attention, some of these things fit right in with some of the signs of stress that we talked about. I know that everybody knows what absenteeism is. Most of you probably know that presenteeism refers to being at work, but you might as well not be there because you're not getting hardly anything done. So showing up, the body's there, but maybe the brain's not there. Mistakes and accidents are anathema to many of us. So these are effects of sleep deprivation. I like to summarize it up and say that the majority of negative variables increase, they spike when we're fatigued, when we haven't had enough rest, and the majority of positive variables in terms of productivity, collaboration, concentration, efficiency, and effectiveness, those tend to drop when we are sleep deprived. And many of you might have a smile on your face when I say limit your daytime naps to 30 minutes. You might say, oh my gosh, I haven't had a daytime nap on a weekday since I was 19 years old. Once again, I'm sharing information from the National Sleep Foundation with you. What they're talking about here is not chiding you if you don't take regular naps. They're saying that studies have shown that you're better off taking a short nap rather than a longer nap. It's easier to wake up if you don't get fully immersed in the depth of your circadian rhythm. So if somebody takes an hour and a half or 2-hour nap, it often takes them a whole lot longer to get up and get going again than if they can take a 30 or 40-minute cat nap. Caffeine and nicotine, definitely not our friends at nighttime. Exercising, and that's exercising long enough before you try and go to sleep that your body isn't still amped up from your workout. Some food can be very disruptive. We want to stay away from blue light on our screen devices. And this regular bedtime is important, and cooler rooms tend to be better. Anyway, I'm just kind of flying through this information about sleep hygiene because I wanted to get to the Connor Davidson resilience scale. I think it's important for each of us to be able to do a little bit of self-assessment, to be able to say, okay, so Rick gave us this definition about resilience as being the ability to withstand, recover, and grow in the face of stressors and changing demands. Well, but what does that look like? What does that sound like? Well, the reality is that that Doctors Connor and Davidson identified a couple of dozen variables that were directly correlated with resilience, and this is their distilled version. They did factor analysis and found that these 10 items are very, very strongly correlated with resilience. So I don't want you to do it now, but you will have the slides when you get them downloaded. So I would encourage each of you seriously before the end of the day today to do this assessment. And don't show it to anybody, just do it for yourself. Are you honestly able to adapt when changes occur? Are you that person who can say, oh, okay, so the procedure for ordering supplies just changed. Darn it, how am I ever going to get a ream of paper around here anymore? Yeah, so that means you might be a 0 or a 1 on I'm able to adapt when changes occur. If you're that person that says, okay, sure, that's the new process, that's the new protocol. Yeah, let me see what it takes. Okay, so that's 4 steps. The other one was 6 steps. Oh, sweet. Let me adapt that new thing. Then you'd be higher on this scale. Dealing with whatever comes your way versus being upset because things didn't work out the way you wanted. A sense of humor has been positively correlated with resilience, and it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, that we're able to see the irony or see that there is another aspect, another side. So once again, I won't go through each of those. You've got that information in front of you. But I wanted you to have that measuring stick once again as a tool. So if you can do this and take baseline data, that's something that a lot of my colleagues, especially my epidemiologist colleagues, like to do here at CDC. Collect some baseline data when you're feeling fine, when everything's good, nothing's blowing up, nothing's on fire, nothing's flooded. And then you could ask yourself these same questions and rate yourself when you're 3 or 4 days in or a week and a half in to some type of an emergency response situation, and you're trying to dig out from under earthquake damage or flood damage or whatever. And that will give you a comparison to baseline that will say, oh my gosh, I used to be an average of about 3.5, and now I've dropped to about a 1.5 or whatever. So that would give you some data. This next super simple circle, looking at what slice of pie in this pie chart you're getting on an average day, or I should say an average night if we're looking at the sleep section. But I would ask you to think about that. We talk about a balanced life. I know a historic figure who was a leader of men and a leader of women. And he said, you know, we should all work for 8 hours a day, we should sleep for 8 hours a day, and we should recreate for 8 hours a day. I'd never heard the word recreate used as a verb, but that's about as balanced as you can get. So I would ask you at some point, hopefully within the next couple of days, because you're unlikely to be remembering this come Monday or Tuesday, so maybe today would be a good day to take a look at this. Are you sleeping for 6 to 9 hours a night, depending on your age, depending on your needs? Do you have some relaxation time built in? Are you getting some exercise? Is there adequate family time? Anyway, I don't need to belabor that point, because the reality is that the Surgeon General has talked to us about the fact that mental health is the successful performance of mental function. It results in productive activities, which is what we're shooting for in our work environment, and I would suggest also in our personal life, fulfilling relationships with other people, and the ability to adapt to change and to cope with adversity. So really, the Surgeon General put in a resilience component into the definition of mental health, which is what we want to maintain before any type of disaster strikes. We also want to maintain that during and after. And I've attached some resources for you here on slides 28. You can see some URLs to hit some of this information. And I appreciate you participating by raising your hands. And I'm happy to address questions or clarify anything that might be of value. Thank you very much, and I wish you well in your emergency response and disaster response work.
Thank you so much, Rick. Participants, this is a great time to think about any questions you might have for Rick, and also to remember to download the PDF of his presentation so you can do the self-assessment and have access to these great resources that he has mentioned.
And I will gladly jump in and ask the first question as people are kind of gathering their thoughts. Thanks so much, Rick. This is definitely a subject that I've definitely seen people talk about when we do, or when we're, sitting in a classroom talking about an emergency situation. And I see a lot of heads, nod at the importance of self-care. But I will also admit that I see that kind of agreement go out the window in the height of an emergency response.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of like all of the other little things that we should be doing. I kind of think like flossing. I know it's good for me, but I definitely don't do it as often as I should. Do you have any recommendations for, the in the moment scenarios of how you can still, keep that value on self-care?
Yes, and thank you for that question. Appreciate that, Stacy. And you're
Mm-hmm.
exactly right. The majority of us do get caught up in the thick of thin things. We've got all these pressures. We're trying to set an example. What I have seen be very, very effective, and I wish I could say I've seen it uniformly and consistently, but when I see a leader who is very engaged, who's working at least as much as her colleagues, maybe more, is putting in long hours, but I see them taking a break, and let's say everybody's been working until 7 or 8 trying to get stuff done. If I see them at 5:30 or 6 say, you know what, um, I've been going as hard as I could go for the last 4 days, and I am just about spent. I'm gonna disengage here a couple hours earlier than I have been because I've got to go out and take a walk, man. If I don't see some sunlight, some sunshine, I'm worried about how I'm going to wind up. I've seen a leader that had a yoga mat that at the beginning of the day they would come in a little bit early, and not trying to make a big deal out of it, not trying to tell everybody else what they need to do. But I've seen somebody a couple of weeks into an extended response go over to a quiet place with a yoga mat, and they had their dog facing downward for a half an hour, 45 minutes. Once again, not making a big deal out of it. So if leadership can set an example, if leadership can encourage, and if leadership cannot punish people who do disengage, that can go a long way to empowering people. It reminds them, if they're able to see other people doing it, and it makes them not feel guilty. When Hurricane Katrina hit, there was the FEMA workers, along with a lot of other federal agency workers, were working really, really long hours. But apparently, some senior FEMA person went home like at 5 o'clock, and the news media got a hold of that, and it's like, oh, here's this big hurricane, and the FEMA people are working a 9 to 5 hour day. Well, after that, lots of federal employees said, oh my gosh, we've got to be here from sun up till sundown. We have to be working ridiculous hours. And that doesn't necessarily improve the productivity. In fact, in the long run, it decreases productivity because of those outcomes, because of those results of fatigue. So I'm sorry for that really long answer to your question, but if it can be encouraged, if it can be built in, and also if we already have the habits. It's difficult to do Tai Chi if you've never been to a class. It's difficult to do yoga, any flavor of yoga, if you don't have an idea what's going on. If you've never done a push-up or you've never done any planking, you're unlikely to start in the middle of an emergency response when you got 4 people crammed into a crappy little hotel someplace.
No, I completely understand. I mean, now you're making me think about what we say a lot in our trainings about the worst time to put a disaster plan together is in the midst of a disaster. So,
Exactly.
so just like taking care of yourself, you should take care of yourself in all manner and not just decide to start taking care of yourself in the midst of a disaster.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, Ella, have we had any comments yet? Or questions, I should say?
We just had a question that came in from one of our participants that says, during a disaster that was Hurricane Maria, we had to work on the response team on our institution, but then we'd have to go back to our homes where our family was under distress. How can you get the time for yourself and your own individual distress without feeling guilty about abandoning your professional distress?
Yeah, no, that is a fantastic question, and that's something that most healthcare professionals have to deal with any kind of a natural disaster. And I prefer to call it natural and human caused as opposed to man-made, because man-made would be a sexist term, even though most terrorists are men anyway. So natural disasters and human disasters, and to me, it gets back to what we were just talking about the worst time to develop a plan is in the middle of the event. So the American Red Cross and FEMA have lots of materials available about very, very basic things that every family should have. I'm a father of 2 sons and 2 daughters. I've got 10 grandbabies. And each of my kids has a communication plan. So if something happens, is there a common meeting place? Do we all have a couple of different cell numbers? And a lot of us don't remember phone numbers anymore because it's in our phone, right? So there should be a communication plan. There should be some kind of an evacuation plan. There should be a 72-hour kit that's got some fairly high calorie snacks in it. So I'm not trying to circumvent the issue. It's a very, very difficult question, but there is a story. I mentioned that I grew up in Oregon, Idaho, and Nevada. There's a story about a farmer who was trying to hire a new farmhand. And he interviewed this one guy, and the guy said, he said, "Why should I hire you?" And the guy said, "Because I can sleep when the wind blows." And the farmer didn't quite get that, but he seemed to have a good bit of experience. So this guy worked for the farmer for a couple of months, and then one day a big storm came through, and the farmer woke up in the middle of the night, and he went running down to where this farmhand was, and he said, "Hey, you need to get out and close all the corral doors." And the guy said, "Yeah, no, I've already done that. I did that last night." He says, "Well, we need to get all of the cows in from this one field." And he said, "Yeah, I did it. They're in the barn, and there's adequate food and there's adequate water in the barn." And the farmer went down this list of all these things that he needed to do, and he realized that his farmhand had already done that. That's why he said, "I'm able to sleep when the wind blows." So I would suggest that those of us who know that we have emergency response as a part of our day job have an obligation to make sure that our families have a communication plan. And you literally can log on to the American Red Cross website. FEMA has excellent materials on being prepared. Are you ready? Is the name that comes to mind for a workbook that talks about different things that we can do. But if I know that that there is at least 72 hours or whatever your budget and space can handle, it makes me then better able to concentrate on what's going on. If I've got phone numbers, if I have a backup plan, if there's somebody else that can pick up my kids at daycare if I get jammed up, those kinds of things enable us, metaphorically speaking, to be able to sleep when the wind blows.
Interesting. Okay, we have a comment from one of our participants who says, oh, wait, sorry, I just navigated away from it. Who says, this is all incredibly, he says, "Thank you for the emphasis on affirmatively providing services and opportunities rather than waiting for requests. My experience has been there can be a large barrier to asking for services even when we realize we should ask." Um, And then we have a question from one of our participants that says, this is all incredibly helpful. We've talked about preparing sets of disaster supplies. Perhaps it's a good idea to keep a set of sort of self-care disaster supplies ready to go, like a kit based on self-care. On the self-care slide, you had anything from numbers of people we need to contact to books. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I could not possibly agree more with that suggestion. I backed up to slide number 20, which I hope is still visible, about those 5 different areas. I literally do encourage people when I do pre-deployment briefings to have specific items in each of these areas. For example, some people have contact lenses, or they have they need a contact lens solution. And if they get out in the middle of no place, or if they get in austere conditions, or heaven forbid the power goes out, which is likely to happen in a lot of the kinds of disasters that we're talking about, and they can't get their proper eye material or their medications, we need to have backup on that kind of stuff. Also, a good idea to have a copy of prescription information in case we need to go to a drugstore close by, or we were just right at the end of our 30-day or 90-day maintenance drugs or whatever. So yes, I agree 100% with having that information ready, having some water storage, and being prepared, which kind of gets, it's related to the previous comment, which I appreciate as well, is that it is difficult for many of us to ask for resources. Once again, if we can have cooperative agreements, if we can know the other players, it makes it easier to do some informal shifting of resources. But yes, on both a family and an individual level, growing up out west, back in the day, sometimes you're driving between towns, and you might go a half an hour or 45 minutes without seeing another car. We always used to have, when I was a kid, a quart of oil in the trunk of our car, and a blanket, in addition to some flares and a couple of bottles of water. We actually didn't have bottles of water then; we had a canteen. But the point is the same. Yeah, absolutely. Gives us the ability to concentrate on what we need to concentrate on that moment, and to have talked to our family members ahead of time, rather than trying to get them if the cell lines are jammed up, or heaven forbid our smartphone's dead. I would even go so far as to suggest that it's a pretty good idea to have a hand crank cell phone recharger. And we had a big storm here in Atlanta, and you may know that Atlantans tend to be fairly wimpy when it comes to heavy weather. But a friend of mine was stuck in Snowmageddon here in Atlanta a couple of years ago, and he's a former Navy SEAL, and after he'd been stuck on the road for about 4 hours, he felt that other people might be having some distress. And so he went around to some cars, and he had a case of water in the back of his vehicle, and he was passing out this water, and he was amazed at how few people had anything in their car. And virtually nobody had a cell phone recharger in their car, because even though they had a functional car and gas in their gas tank, if you don't have your cell phone recharger and the proper USB adapter to the cigarette lighter, or you have a brand new car that's got the built-in smartphone recharger, you're out of luck. And so when he ran out of bottles of water, he was knocking on windows, making sure people were okay. And some people said, "I don't have any water." And he says, "Well, do you have any kind of a container?" Because it was raining. He said, put that Frisbee on top of your car, and it will collect some water. Put that used convenience store cup that on top of your car and collect some water. So first aid kits, those kinds of things. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm repeating myself now, but I'm an Eagle Scout. Both of my sons are Eagle Scouts, so that whole be prepared thing is part of my DNA.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have another question from one of our participants who said, thank you for sharing these online resources. Do you have any print materials or published books that you feel are beneficial, both for the planning and preparing stage, and then to be used for aftercare approaches?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I'm turned around looking at my bookcase right now. I think at CDC, we're discouraged from recommending any kind of commercial products, so we don't want it to look like we're endorsing anybody.
The
But
same rule applies for the Smithsonian too.
okay, yeah, but if it's free and if it's federal, I'm okay. I just pulled out of my bookcase. It's a half-inch thick workbook, and it's called "Are You Ready?" And it says an in-depth guide to citizen preparedness. And it was developed by FEMA, and you used to be able to download a PDF. And I don't know if it's still in print, because this is several years old, but it has all the information in there. The last time I was on the American Red Cross website, they did have that information. So I guess between the American Psychological Association document that I referenced, The Road to Resilience, that brochure is available from the American Psychological Association, and FEMA and the Red Cross can hook you up with a lot of relevant stuff. And they also have PDFs that you can print out for wallet-sized cards, so you have contact information of your family and friends. You could have a babysitter's number. You could have, neighbors' numbers. If you can't access that on your smartphone. So I'm sorry, I'm referring back to URLs or the previous comments, but yeah, I think going with those kinds of documents is a safe way to go.
Great, thanks, Rick. Let's see, we do have room for maybe one more question. If anybody's been sitting on anything, definitely get it off your chest. I feel like of all of our webinars, this is the webinar where we should feel comfortable getting things off of our chest.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Okay. Well, I do have actually kind of a comment and actually an idea for some of our participants on the webinar today. Just thinking about our preparedness for our own collections emergencies. I was actually thinking ways to interweave self-care and healthy practices into that. I'm thinking of our inventory sheets that we recommend putting into emergency carts around our institutions. And actually, I wonder, and Rick, stop me if you think this is a bad idea, but I'm thinking, depending on the scale of emergencies in our collections, one person might be filling out these inventory sheets for hours and hours and hours. And I wonder if we could interleave like a piece of paper every 5 or 10 sheets that says, stop, you have, satisfied your quota, in your inventory, because we know that at this point you've probably spent about X amount of hours filling these out. You deserve a break. And then that kind of forces people almost like an inject that they have once they reach that piece of paper, boop, they have to take a break.
Yeah, no, Stacy, I think that's a great idea. It's a nice reminder, and it could be as simple as a post-it, like you say, every 10 pages or every whatever you determine. And it might say something as simple as please take a 15-minute break, go out and stretch, rest your eyes, drink some water. Obviously, I haven't mentioned hydration a whole lot, but that's key to so much of what we're doing. So I think that's a great idea to build that in there as a reminder.
Oh,
Absolutely.
good.
And our participants are enthusiastic about the idea as well.
Oh, good. Thanks, guys.
Lots of raised hands and smiley faces, huh?
Okay.
That must be it.
So, okay, well then I guess we can start wrapping up. And actually, if I can take this opportunity, it actually is emergency season. And I don't mean that as emergencies are occurring. It's just that in the museum and cultural heritage field, under under AIC's May Day initiative, it's that time of year to kind of take a moment and address your cultural institutions' readiness, preparedness, and kind of generate a all hands on deck, response preparation. So that is normally done on May 1st, but I can speak from personal experience that the Smithsonian is ramping up some training in honor of May Day, and I hope everyone out there is thinking about this too. So maybe this year, guys, you go out and try to tackle self-care and recognizing burnout and stress in your emergency plans. That could maybe be something that could engage, different people in your museum rather than the traditional collections managers and conservators talking again about how they would respond in a time of crisis. So I push that little announcement out to you all. So thanks again, Rick. This is great. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and some very tangible tools. As we're wrapping up, I just want to say that all of you will be receiving a follow-up webinar survey to your email tomorrow. And it just has a few questions on what you thought of today's presentation. Since this is Hart's first webinar series, we definitely are very eager to hear any type of feedback that you have so we can improve it for the next time around. So let's see. All right. And then there we go. I accidentally minimized my notes. Please join us for our next and final webinar, which is on Tuesday, May 15th, with Lori Foley, Administrator of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is in the Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation in FEMA. Many of you know Lori. We work with her very closely, and she's currently deployed in Puerto Rico. And she will be talking about navigating public assistance, advice for cultural stewards, and emergency managers. So we're looking forward to hearing from her in a couple of weeks. So again, thanks again to you, Rick, and thanks to you, everybody. We hope to see you then.
Yep, we'll see you Tuesday, May 15th. Thank you so much.